Hi everyone! Here's another tutorial for you. I am using graphite pencils and later on I will also use a charcoal pencil. I'll put a full list of materials under the video. For the sketch I first traced over the basic outlines so I could get started with the shading. And now I'm just going over the sketch with an HB mechanical pencil so the outline is visible for you before I start shading. First, I'll be drawing with these three graphite pencils. When I shade with graphite pencils, I always build up the layers gradually and I start with the lightest, the 5B. I shade with light pressure and as always I draw in small sections so I can focus on one section at a time. When I shade, I pay attention to the reference photo to see where the shadows and where the highlights are. If you want to draw something realistic, you need to create different values. After the first layer, I blend with the blending stump. And now with light pressure, I go over the first layer with the next pencil. Now the next layer, again with light pressure. Because the eyebrow is darker, I start with the 7B, and after every layer I smudge the graphite. Here I'm using the graphite that's still on the blending stump to shade. For the darkest shading, I use the black pencil. This black pencil that I am using is oil-based and doesn't always blend that well. Since I'm using tone paper, I noticed later on that this black pencil isn't really that black on camera. Because I wanted to create really dark shadows, I'm going to try using charcoal later on. I actually tried to darken this eye later on with the charcoal, but the charcoal won't go over the graphite and the oil-based pencil very well. Of course, it's up to you to use what you want or the materials you have. But after figuring out how charcoal works, I would recommend using charcoal if you want to create very dark values and if you are also going to use toned paper. I actually tried a charcoal pencil before, but I couldn't sharpen it without crumbling or breaking, so I didn't use it anymore. I recently bought another brand and I could sharpen this one with my regular sharpener. So I thought I'd give charcoal another try. I feel like I could draw more precise with the graphite pencils, but the charcoal is great for darker shading because I couldn't find any really black pencil that was dark enough to create a good contrast that makes the drawing really pop. Also with charcoal, you can get very dark value without that shininess you get with graphite. I'm also going to try using charcoal on other paper because I'm not really satisfied with this paper. This is gray recycled paper and I feel like it's not thick enough to hold all of these layers. This is the charcoal pencil I'm using, and now I notice that I can't go over the graphite with the charcoal. So now I try to darken some more using the black pencil. For the other eye, I do the same. I build up the layers with the graphite pencils and darken with the black pencil. If you are using graphite pencils, you can shade this way, or if you are using charcoal, you would define the shadows first. I will shade the nose using charcoal, so then you will see what I mean. You see how I use the blending stump to shade the midtones with the graphite that's already on the stump. Even though you traced over some basic outlines, you can't trace every detail, and maybe sometimes you will lose some lines after shading. I normally use my pencil, or like now the stump, because that's what I was using. I measure like this from where the eyes are to define where the shadow under the eye and above the eye will be. I also do this when I want to check if the proportions are still correct. You could also use a ruler, but it's important to check this while you are drawing the eyes. And later when you are drawing the nose and the lips, because you don't want your proportions to be off, and only notice this when you are almost done with the portrait. The correcting you need to do will be more difficult then. I use the kneaded eraser to gently pull up some of the graphite. The kneaded eraser is great to use if you just want to lighten rather than fully erase. It's also great because you can mold it into any shape and make a very sharp point for small areas. When I need to fully erase, I use the pencil eraser. Never press too hard when you erase, because you don't want to damage the paper. Also make sure to clean the pencil eraser in between, otherwise you will be smudging instead of erasing. When drawing eyebrows, I build up the layers, shading in the same direction as the hairs are growing. On top of the eyebrow, you will see some loose hairs. I use a clean soft tissue when I want to smudge evenly, and because there isn't any graphite on, like on the stump, it won't darken, but just smudge. I start drawing the lashes with the graphite pencil, and later I darken them with the black pencil. I always draw lashes in layers, because some are darker and some are lighter where the light hits. I use the white acrylic marker for the brightest highlights in the eye. You could leave this white if you are drawing on white paper, but because I smudge a lot, I like to use the white marker to get the highlight really bright. Now for the other highlights where the light hits the face, I use the white charcoal pencil, because I'm drawing on toned paper. If I drew this on white paper, I would just leave those parts white. Once the paint is dry, I can go over the highlight with some graphite that's on the stump to make it a bit less bright. To shade evenly, I hold the pencil more to the back and shade with the side of the pencil lead, and always with light pressure. Now I use the soft tissue to smudge this evenly. I smudge around the white charcoal. You could smudge gently over the white charcoal if you think it's too bright. For the nose, I decided to use the charcoal pencil to see how that goes. I start with light pressure and I don't shade over the parts that will be lighter. I will define where the shadows will be and then shade with the blending stump for the midtones. You could also use a small brush to smudge and blend the charcoal, but I like to have more control and the blending stumps have a sharp point, so I like to use these. I also have different sizes of these. With a lighter graphite pencil, I shade the midtones for an even layer. If I compare the eye to the shadow under the nose, the eye needs to be a bit darker. So I tried to darken this eye some more, but I couldn't really layer over the graphite and black pencil anymore. Also, you could really see the shininess from the graphite coming through. You don't see that with the charcoal. At this point, I actually wanted to start over and just start with charcoal, so I could darken the eye. But then I thought I'll just continue and see how I can go from here. Because I want you to be able to follow my journey, and that means through trial and error. If I don't show any mistakes I make, you won't be able to learn from it like I do. I start shading the cheek with the light graphite pencil. I hold the pencil more to the back and shade with light pressure. I'm defining where the shadow of the cheekbone will be. And for a smooth effect, I smudge this with the soft tissue. Now another layer where the skin is a bit darker. When shading skin, I always build up the layers, starting with light layers. Take your time and try to have patience while you are drawing. If you feel like you are rushing, maybe taking a break will help. Taking a break every now and then will also help you see any mistakes you have made. Try to look at your portrait as if there are all these shapes. Like, don't think of seeing a nose or lips, but try seeing different shapes, where the light falls and the shadows cast. Look at a reference or at your own face and study where the highlights are because of the light that hits the face, and where the shadows are because of the shape of the face that creates the shadows. Like, for example, under the nose, or on one side of the face if the light is coming from the side. There shouldn't be any lines in your portrait drawing. That is what will make your drawing actually look realistic and not flat. I shade with a darker graphite pencil to start creating the shadows on the face. Now the face is starting to look more round. White charcoal doesn't go over graphite, so I used the kneaded eraser to lighten. And I'm going to correct the nose a bit because it didn't look right. After another break, I saw that this eye was too light, so I'm going to darken everything a bit. I'm a bit stubborn and I really wanted to darken this eye, so I'm trying again. I keep on trying to go over with the charcoal. Because I didn't get the nose right in the first place, I spent a lot of time correcting. That's why it's important to notice any mistakes you made in an early stage and not when you are almost done. Now onto the forehead. I start with charcoal because if I start with the graphite, I won't be able to darken as much as I want. I also use light pressure when I shade with the charcoal pencil because I don't want to get it very dark immediately. I want to build up the layers until I'm satisfied. I smudge in between the layers to see how it looks. It's better to go over a couple of times to darken than to start too dark and need to correct. With some charcoal that's still on the stump, I go over the cheekbone a bit to darken. I didn't shade on this part of the forehead because it's where the light hits, so I'm going to brighten the highlight with white charcoal. And then I smudge around it with the soft tissue, so there aren't any lines. And later on I will go over it a bit with the soft tissue again when I notice it's too bright. For the lips, I'm only going to use the charcoal pencil. And I start by defining the darker parts. For the darker shadows, I use light to medium pressure, and for the midtones, I use very light pressure. Using the charcoal is actually a bit faster, because with graphite I have to build up the layers starting from lighter to darker graphite pencils. With graphite pencils you have harder and softer leads, so you can shade lightly using the harder leads and shade darker with the softer leads. When using charcoal you only have one pencil, so this requires some different techniques. It's actually the other way around. With graphite pencils I start lightly, build up the layers gradually to create the shadows, and with charcoal I define the shadows first, and then smudge the charcoal to create the midtones. Then I use the kneaded eraser or pencil eraser to create the highlights. For the brighter highlights I use the white charcoal pencil, and for the brightest highlights, the acrylic marker. If the highlight is too bright, I gently shade over it with the dirty blending stump. When I film, I use two softbox daylight lamps, one on the left and one on the right, so I don't have to depend on the daylight from outside. Now, after using more charcoal, you can really see the difference. You can see the graphite shine on the eye on the left now. With charcoal you won't have that shine. Now, the difference between the kneaded eraser and the pencil eraser is I use the kneaded eraser to pick up most of the graphite to lighten where I want to, and I use the pencil eraser where I want to erase small details. There isn't really much of a difference though, but because the tip of the pencil eraser is harder, you will have more control than with the kneaded eraser. For the tutorials, I usually put the speed on 2, because otherwise the videos will be too long, and I think this is slow enough to follow along. You could also pause the video when you need to. So, if you are wondering how long a drawing took me, that usually would be twice as long as the video. I'm using the white acrylic marker for the brightest highlights on the lips. The white charcoal doesn't go well over graphite or black charcoal, and this goes over everything. Once the paint is dry, I gently go over it with the dirty stump to make the highlights a little less bright. I don't smudge, but dab over it. After another break, I'm correcting the shadow of the cheekbone a bit, because it needs to be lower. You see that I take some of the charcoal from here and I use it to shade. If I want to darken, I just add some graphite with light pressure. I smudge a lot with the soft tissue because I want to make sure I have a smooth transition between the different values. For the ear, I also start with defining the shadows. And I shade a lot using the blending stump. Now for the midtones, I use the graphite pencil. Now I blend everything with the soft tissue, and this makes it look flat. So I go back and darken the shadows, and I will create the highlights with the kneaded eraser. Here you see how it looks without the light reflecting. You see that only the graphite is shiny, but the charcoal looks the same. I'm definitely going to be using charcoal for the dark shadows from now on. After using a charcoal pencil for the first time, I actually really like it. It works faster, it smudges really well, it erases really well, you can create really dark value, and you don't get that graphite shine. The only thing is that you can't get a very sharp tip as with the graphite pencils. So if you are drawing a small portrait, it will be more difficult to create the small details. But I actually never draw really small portraits because the bigger the drawing, the more details. Just adding some final details. I always find it difficult to call it finished. I often keep on correcting and adding details. Well, that's it for this tutorial. This is part 1, and I will show how I draw the hair in the next video. I really hope you have learned something, and don't hesitate to ask me any questions. Thanks for watching!